Sally, thank you ever so much for joining us today on the first episode of our new podcast. So really straight over to you. What I'd love for us to talk about to start with is a little bit about your career trajectory and about sort of what you've done, from previous years and what sort of led you to being a managing director of NHS Property Services. So let's start right at the beginning, right? So university, what was your degree in and how did you find yourself moving into the world of property?
Okay, so firstly, thank you very much for talking to me today. It's really nice to just be able to reflect a little bit on what we're going to be talking about. I started my journey with a degree in music after I left school. It was something at the time that I had a real passion for, something I sort of potentially saw a career in. And I think at the end of my 3 years at university, I'd had a bit of a change of heart in terms of what that career path might look like. And at that point, I didn't really know what to do.
Right.
So I applied for a number of different government graduate schemes.
Okay.
And I was lucky to be placed in a contract management role within the Department for Work and Pensions.
Right.
And that kind of threw me into the world of property, which is not something I'd considered before. So I spent 2 years as a contract manager for the Department for Work and Pensions on a sort of private property initiative contract. And then after that 2 years, I transferred over to the private company that were managing the estate. So it was an aged estate that property company had taken on a 20-year contract.
Wow.
And I joined them as an FM. And spent the next 10 years on that contract kind of progressing my way through different FM roles. So I did some operational roles, some non-operational roles, and left there having been a regional manager for the London and East of England portfolio.
Wow.
So it was a real eye-opener.
I can imagine.
And kind of made me really have a passion for property after that. And that's where I decided I kind of wanted to continue my career.
Wow. Well, what a start to your career, right? I think we can all look back and say some of us, find our feet and join an organisation where it just fits straight away and we get this opportunities afforded to us. And sometimes we're a little bit lucky. Some people maybe not so fortunate. Obviously, there's a lot of hard work that goes into that, right? You make your own luck. But what was it that, made that transition? And that for those who are listening, graduates in particular, coming out, I think we can all still remember, no matter how old we get, that fear of that first job, those interviews, with a little bit of panic going, oh my God, welcome to the real world of work. What was that experience like for you going into property, especially having not done it before? How did they put you at ease? What was that experience like?
I think it's really important to embrace opportunities. So at the time, I guess I could have said, I don't have a background in property. Yeah. Is that the right role for me? But actually, I just kind of embraced it and threw myself into it and did everything I could to gather knowledge. And I was really lucky to work for some great directors at the time who really led me in the right way, but also showed me what I could be in the future. And that's kind of stayed with me. There's a couple of managers that I had in that first role that really inspired me. And I still think back in scenarios that I go through today, I still think back to what I learnt from them. So that I think my advice to any graduates or anybody kind of starting off in their first role is about grab every opportunity, be interested. Yeah. Don't just scratch the surface. Take the time to really delve into things in a deeper way and really understand what you're doing. And I think then you sort of find your way in what you love. I did some non-operational roles, which I actually didn't really enjoy, but I thought I'll try them, see how they go. Did some very technical roles. Actually, I decided that I really love being hands-on and operational. And so that's the path I took. Right.
Okay. Interesting. So I was going to ask, the opportunities that were afforded to you as you started to progress your career, that, obviously that comes with, like you just mentioned, that investing and taking time to hone your craft, I suppose. Yeah. And, I know that you've done further qualifications, obviously now, and you're looking to take on even more now, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. But, how did you sort of, what steps did you take to invest further? Was there anything specific you started reading about? Was there courses or was it internal training? Just sort of trying to give some people some different ideas on how to develop themselves. Because I think people get to a certain parts of their career where they start to find a ceiling. And they're always kind of go, how do I get that experience? I can't get to the next level without that experience. So, I think a lot of it is, it's looking internally sometimes and stuff that they can do themselves. So any advice around that?
There's a few different things. So I did some professional qualifications early on. So I did my NEBOSH qualification because that was something I actually was very interested in, and the business at the time were willing to sponsor me through it. I do a lot of reading around the subject, and especially around where you're dealing with a specific customer in a specific sector. So at the time, it was a Department for Work and Pensions contract, and I was living and breathing that every day in terms of what their property requirements are. So it's about also really understanding your customer and taking the time to kind of research a little bit about what they're doing, because that then influences how you sort of perform and behave in your role. I would say as well, it's about seeking people out. And for me, that's been something that's kind of gone throughout my career. It's about finding those colleagues within your business that maybe have different skill sets to you, but that you can feed off of and that you can share knowledge with. And I think it's really important to have that community around you within the workplace where you can really, sort of share ideas and work together. And certainly I did a podcast for NHS Property Services last year around imposter syndrome, and it's something we talked about. It was something I hadn't thought about before, and we talked about it in terms of how do you find your way within a workplace and within your career. And it was a lot of talking around finding those people who can empathise with you and who can understand what you're going through and have that strength alongside you to help you progress in your career. And that was something that, having reflected on imposter syndrome and what it meant, actually, yes, maybe I have experienced it in the past, and how have I got through it? It's about being comfortable in the workplace and having the people around you to support you.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fantastic bit of advice, and I think we take it for granted, and I've worked for a large-scale PLC, that's where I started my career, and I think you take for granted being surrounded by frequently great people, and actually by just even getting on your own 2 feet and exploring the rest of the business, interacting with people, which I think, in part was a lot easier before COVID when we were all working in an office 5 days a week. Don't cancel me, people. But I think there was a benefit of that. And I think that collective learning and shared learning experience, I think, is hugely undervalued, I think, sometimes now. So, no, that's great. So what that sort of leads me on to, obviously, we talked about that progression and development that you experienced. What was the sort of the next part of your career? Because obviously you were there for, as you mentioned, it was 10 years, and then you were looking at sort of that next venture. What prompted you to make that move at that time? And, what was the next step for you, and where did you go?
So I think I was sort of reflecting on where I was at that point. And I'd been on that contract for 10 years. The contract was coming to an end. I felt like I'd gone as far as I could go within that organisation. And I decided to do something different. So I went and worked for a social housing organisation to set up a hard FM team from scratch, which seemed really exciting. It was going to be, a project that I could see through from start to finish. And that was a really good journey and a very different journey for me. Dealing with property at a sort of business corporate level, and then dealing with housing. There are some synergies, but there is a lot of differences in how that works. So I spent 2 years setting up a team to deliver maintenance across a broad portfolio within London for that social housing organisation. But ultimately, I really missed the full-on operational role of facilities management and property management. Right. And so that after I'd finished that project, I felt like, I'd done that well. I was happy with what I'd achieved. But again, I didn't see myself going any further because I ultimately missed the facilities management type of operational role. And that's what I sought out for my next role, and that's when I joined NHS Property Services.
So thank you for sharing that. So I think what gives you a really unique perspective is having worked from sort of going from a big corporate client, Telereal and Trillium, through to then social housing, and now obviously with the NHS property services. So what did you find with I guess the biggest challenge from going from that big corporate into the world of social housing? How was that different for you?
So it was quite a nice mix when I worked for Telereal Trillium, because whilst we were a corporate organisation, we were working on a public sector contract.
Yeah.
So I got to see both sides of FM and property management at that point. Moving into the social housing sector was really interesting, and it was a move I really wanted to make because it seemed like an exciting project. But it was challenging in terms of the end users of the service that you're providing. So, we're very much a community-based service, and every job that our engineers went out to do, there was somebody in their home at the end of that. And it gives you a real sense of responsibility in terms of doing that job right. So setting up that team to deliver that, I was very conscious of that. Everything that we did was about an end user who's in their home, and they want you to do a good job so that they can live in a safe, house at the end of the day. So that move for me, there was a lot around investment in property that sort of came to light. So whereas previously I'd worked in a corporate organisation on a contract where we were investing in those properties on a life cycle maintenance regime, moving to social housing where every day you were faced with a different problem with a limited pot of funding to put those problems right, it was about identifying how we could get the most out of the funding that we had to ensure that we kept our residents safe and in homes that you would want to live in yourself. And so that challenge was ever present. I do think it's the budget constraints that I found hardest to overcome in terms of, what's the focus, what's the list of things we need to do, and what's the most important thing. And then moving to NHS Property Services, I love being part of the public sector again, and going home at the end of every day thinking I've done something for the community, I've impacted patient care or whatever it is we've done that day. It all ends up contributing to what we deliver within the wider NHS system. And again, there are the challenges around budgets and investment and an ageing estate, which potentially we can come on to later, that resonate with my previous role. But ultimately, being back in facilities management and property management is my kind of comfortable, happy place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that part, Sally. So I think it was really clear for all of our listeners that your face completely lights up when you're talking about the NHS and your motivators for that. But I think just to expand upon that, clearly somebody with your caliber of CV would have had multiple of options available to you. So what was it that sort of going back to say like a Telereal Trillium, or going to another big corporate like Cushman's and Wakefield, CBRE, what was it that made the NHS really stand out for you?
So I think obviously the NHS, national institution, so everybody knows about it. Everyone understands the challenges that the NHS faces. I was aware that the estate that the NHS has is ageing and is complex, and that kind of challenge quite excited me about joining NHS Property Services. Ultimately, I like to come to work and do a job that I enjoy, and that I go home at the end of the day satisfied that I've made an impact. And for me, that is a really big thing. And that's what I felt I would get from a role at NHS Property Services. And that's why I took the role that I took originally. So I think it's 5 years I've been at NHS Property Services. And it was at the time a principal operations manager role in London. And I've always worked in London. I love working in London. I like the kind of different aspects of the complex properties that we get in London and the complex customers. And so ultimately it just felt like the right role for me.
Fair enough. So for the listeners, getting a grasp of the NHS, the size of it, the scale of it, I think you speak to most people in Britain, they have no idea even how many people work for NHS. I think it's that global, it's one of the largest employers globally. And I think people kind of forget that a lot. So with that huge headcount comes a huge amount of property, because they've all got to be somewhere at some point. So can you give us a bit of bird's eye view of what the estate is, and just give us a little detail around that, and how that's sort of broken down from your perspective.
Yeah, so NHS Property Services came about in 2013, and we took on at that point 10% of the NHS estate. So we only still have that proportion of it. So it's much wider than our organisation, and that's about 3,000 properties, and that's split into 4 regions: London, which I'm the regional managing director for, and then there's Midlands, South, and the North. And so we run an estate of hospitals, GP surgeries, and health centres, and we run the FM services in a lot of those properties, but we also, as an organisation, have a sort of wider capability around strategic planning, and supporting the wider NHS network with their property portfolio and how they commission services into those properties. The NHS itself is hugely complex, and when I joined NHS Property Services, I did quite a lot of research into the background to it and how it's structured, and it's no easy task when you join the NHS to fully understand how you can navigate every part of it. I'm still learning every day when I talk to my customers about how it all fits together. But ultimately, the NHS is structured through integrated care boards, which run. There's 5 in London, so they're national, and everything within that integrated care board area is then managed from a sort of commissioning point of view and a property point of view. So I've got 5 sort of key areas in London that I focus on and support with their property needs on the part of the estate that they have with us.
So Sally, I think what would be really interesting is, elaborating perhaps a little further on, in particular, your patch, London. Obviously, it's where we both are, it's where we both work and live. And talking about the London estate in particular, and the challenges, specifically you might be facing, and that could be in an array of different types of building. But I guess just give our listeners some further indication and a bit more detail about what that might look like.
Yeah, I mean, certainly London's not unique. It's very similar to the rest of the country in terms of our ageing estate, and the needs of the population from a clinical perspective for the NHS. So, it's fairly similar. But I would say, certainly in London, some of the things we focus on are the health centres we have in areas of social deprivation and how we can support the NHS better in delivering the services they need to in those areas. Certainly across the team, recruitment and retention is a big factor. We want people to want to work for NHS Property Services and come to work and do that good job for the wider NHS system. And sometimes that is more challenging in London than in other areas of the country. But certainly, the team just have to react to whatever comes their way on a daily basis, and that's what FM's all about, right? You never know what you're going to come to, and you've just got to be prepared to deal with those situations. And the team are very aware that every decision they make, there's a patient potentially at the end of that decision. So, it's one thing to have to shut down a building and send some kind of corporate office workers home to work from home because we can't maintain that building for the day. It's another thing to shut a health centre which is potentially going to impact on patients who need that care, and that's an ever-present thought for my team, and we have to be prepared for whatever that day is going to throw at us.
Yeah. I think that's exactly the part that separates you from the rest of the commercial world, is, especially from an FM operations property perspective, is if something goes down, that can be the separation between life and death. Shutting down the wards, shutting down an A&E services, whatever it may be, it just can't be done, right? So there is a weight and a gravitas to that, which I imagine you feel every single day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, our strategy is about enabling excellent patient care. So our teams are all very focused on what they need to do on a daily basis to ensure we implement our strategy. And it's around being that trusted partner for the NHS, supporting them with our strategic capability to ensure that we can enable that excellent patient care alongside them, because it's not about us, it's about our NHS partners and what we can do to support them.
Fantastic. So I guess one last part on, I guess, your career journey, and before we sort of delve into the other parts of the interview. But I think, for me is this sort of, I guess for some people, it's the arrival of, we've all been those grads where we've all looked up and gone, I want to be an MD one day. I want to be a CEO. I want to be a COO, something along those lines. We all have that aspiration, or a lot of us do. I know I still do. Still got some way to go. But as somebody who's achieved that managing director title, how did you find that role coming about? Was that something you had to go and seek? Was that something that was just through head down doing your own, good work that came to you? Or was it something that you had to go, actually, guys, I want more, and this is who I am, and this is where I want to be? Really interested to hear your perspective on that.
So it was a bit of a journey, actually.
Right.
So I joined NHS Property Services as the Principal Operations Manager for London, which was a great role, and I really enjoyed it. I was in that role for 2 years, and then we went through a restructure. And as part of that restructure, my role was kind of removed from the structure, and we put in place the regional MDs. I think there'd been 7 principal operations managers, so that moved to 4 regional MDs. And I applied for that role and didn't actually get the role. So I then took another role in Surrey as an estates delivery partner, reporting into another regional managing director. So I took that role for a year. And during that time, I did quite a lot of reflection in terms of, okay, I really want that MD role. What do I need to do to get that MD role? And so I was very lucky to get the opportunity to study for my level 7 apprenticeship in senior leadership. And so I embarked on that as I got that new role in Surrey. And so I spent a year doing that. And then the regional managing director role in London came back up for interview. And so I applied again a year later, went through the process. And I can say now that as I reflected after the second interview, that I had changed during that year. I'd really looked at myself and thought, what skills do I need? What more do I need to do to grow my knowledge to get to that position? And so I was successful in the role at that point. So having spent a year in Surrey and doing a bit of studying, I then took up the MD role in London a year ago.
Right.
So yeah, it was a journey, and it definitely took quite a lot of hard work on my part, but it was worth it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think, look, that's such a great story in itself, is the journey. I think it's so easy for everyone to forget that there's a lot of hard work that goes into this. I think people kind of go, how did they get there? And there's a little bit of it's sort of outsiders looking in and not understanding somebody's journey. You know what? I worked bloody hard to get here. I put a lot of effort in to get to this place. But I think it's also an important story that we all share as well, that it is a lot of hard work and there is failure as well. Because I think without failure, we don't learn, right? And that moment of self-reflection, I think, is really important as well. Whether we've failed or succeeded, that we self-reflect. And it seems like that's a really important part of your process.
I don't think I'd ever felt it was before.
Right.
I think that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, suddenly realising I really wanted that role and understanding that I needed to maybe do something and put some time and effort into myself in order to get that role. I don't think any point in my career I've ever sort of done that self-reflection, and it certainly paid off. And now I do take that time to probably reflect more and invest more time in myself and my development to kind of grow.
Yeah. So not to, obviously we can talk about it now, and obviously not to linger on the part of where you failed, but I think it's an important part for us to maybe focus on, because again, I think that a lot of people, we can focus very easily on the success of individuals and talk about, how great they are and what they've achieved. But I think the failure is just as an important part of the journey, and no one likes talking about their failures. So I'm sorry if I'm going to, linger on this point, but I think the fact that resilience that you've come back with, just talk to us a little bit about, where was your head after that rejection, and what did it take to pick yourself back up and go, you know what, I'm going for it again?
So I think, it took a few weeks to feel less bruised.
Yeah.
But I guess I am quite a resilient person naturally, and I recognise that I enjoy what I do, and I like working for the organisation. So I thought, actually, rather than being negative about it, let's talk about what I can do in the meantime to get me to the level I need to be at. And that's when we started talking about what I can do to develop myself. And that's when we started looking at, well, maybe it's time to do another qualification, because it's been a long time since I've done any sort of formal learning. And I thought, actually, maybe I'm ready for that now. Maybe I've spent a bit of time, quite a lot of time, just working. Yeah. So maybe now's time to start doing some studying. And I sort of, that helped me pick myself up, because I thought, actually, I can put my energy into, I can do this job, and I can put some energy into doing something completely different. And I think, as I say, after that second interview, even I could see that I was more comfortable in myself. I was more comfortable in the questions I was answering. And I think I'm a better rounded MD now than I would have been if I'd have got the role that first time round. So yeah, it was a long process, and there were some ups and downs, I guess, if I'm being honest. But it's all worked out, really well. And actually, the qualification I've achieved over the last 12 months has been it's just been amazing. Yeah. And it's opened my world up in terms of other business functions and how everything fits together, and probably something I hadn't really been cognizant of previously.
If you don't mind sharing a little bit more about the qualification that you did, Sally, and what that sort of, give a little bit of detail into that qualification, and what you think that why did it take you from not getting the job to perhaps getting the job?
So the senior leadership level 7 apprenticeship was something I hadn't heard of. I didn't even know that level 7 apprenticeships existed. So that was a real eye opener. So that gave me access to a number of modules around financial governance, looking at strategic implementation, enterprise risk management, and it gave me accreditation with the Chartered Management Institute. And so it just gave me a better, well-rounded view of our whole organisation and all the component parts that make up everything we do. And that's actually led now to me doing one more year to get my MBA through doing that level 7 apprenticeship. And so I've just started that 2 weeks ago.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. And I think like MBAs, I think I speak to so many senior executives at your level, C-suite, either have done MBAs or planning on doing MBAs. I've got friends who are doing them, and everybody swears by them. And what do you think an MBA is going to enable you? What sold you on doing this further qualification? Is it the success that you've had from doing that level 7 and you're thinking this could actually push me on to the next level? Or is it a scratch to itch? What is it exactly driving this sort of the push for the MBA?
It's a few things. I think I always wanted to do an MBA. But after doing my original degree, because I wasn't quite sure of the path I was going to take, it didn't seem like the right time. I think it was a bit of a scratch to itch in terms of challenging myself and seeing what I could do. I do actually quite enjoy studying. It's been hard going. I won't deny it. But actually, learning about new aspects of what you do and being able to apply it to your role on a daily basis really helps. You're actually learning really relevant things that you can take to work every day. So that makes it really worthwhile. So, yes, I absolutely want to progress in my career. But this, for me at the moment, sits really nicely with the job that I'm in. And it means that I can really, bring what I'm learning to work, but it's also giving me the time to sort of study different things that I wouldn't have come across otherwise, just doing the day job.
As a female leader, what are your thoughts on sort of diversity at the moment within the NHS?
So it's an interesting one for the NHS because we are such a big, complex organisation, and therefore we are a very diverse workforce naturally.
I think like one of the challenges that I think we see in a lot of organisations, in particular property, right? Let's be frank, it's very much a male-dominated industry. And when I've worked on ED&I projects throughout my career in recruitment, I've had this broad spectrum outside of property, but also technology and financial services and just accounting and finance, all very heavily male-dominated industries. ED&I is a huge part. So I think when I look at different organisations, they're talking about and the ones that have implemented it well and taken it to heart is a more rounded organisation with different mindsets coming together with different experiences and sharing them to create a better organisation. Do you feel like that's something that the NHS, really embodies?
I would say just to start, I would say as a female within the FM sector, I've never felt kind of as a minority. I've always worked in teams where it's been a really good balance between male and female colleagues. As I've said, the NHS is such a big, complex organisation. It's not difficult to be a diverse organisation. For me, the important thing is about how we develop those colleagues within the organisation. And we do, within NHS Property Services, we want to get, grow, keep. That's one of our, key targets. And so we have a lot of programmes internally where we target different groups of colleagues and put them through different qualifications. So we have something called stepping stones. We look at level 2, 3 and 4 apprenticeships for some of our colleagues and look where we can put them through specific career paths that will lead them into a role within our organisation. So for me, we've got a good start in terms of a diverse organisation, but it's how we develop and retain those colleagues within the business.
Really, I think, really interesting point you've picked up there in relation to your own experience, because I'm fortunate enough that my first ever boss was strong female leader. My better halves have been senior leaders, senior female leaders, and unfortunately there's been they've experienced unfortunate discrimination in some parts, sexism. And you mentioned that's something that fortunately you've not experienced. Why do you think that is? You think it's about the organisations or the people around you? What do you think that was down to?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I've reflected on it because we've talked about it, previously, and I can honestly say that I've never felt at a disadvantage from being a female within any of the roles that I've been in. I've been very fortunate to have some very supportive managers and directors who have sort of led me down my career path, and I've never felt that's kind of that my sex has come into it. So I reflected on, had imposter syndrome ever impacted me either in the role that I do or when I've been applying for roles, and I took time out after having both of my children. And at the time, I wanted to get back to work quite quickly. And when I've looked back on the times when I returned to work, I can now see that I think I felt, should I be back at work, number one? Can I still do such a good job when I've got other things going on at home? Can I do such a good job as somebody who doesn't have to get home for childcare? How is it going to impact how I think and how I behave? I think luckily, because I was surrounded by supportive colleagues, and I talked about that earlier in terms of have that network at work where you can talk things through and have sounding boards. I think that I survived. I don't think imposter syndrome had a big impact on me, but I would reflect that it's definitely something that has affected me, and it's important to recognise it and to help other women understand, or men, it can affect, it can affect anybody, how you can support them and what mechanisms you need to have in place to make sure that it doesn't adversely impact the job you're doing or how you're feeling.
Yeah, I think, imposter syndrome, I mean, we could all probably share points, but I think, it's really interesting from your perspective. I think, you touched upon it there, being a working parent, being, the mother as well holds a different role in every family, right? It just does. And, that the way that you balancing, I think, is the best way of putting it for any mother. I can only think of my own mother, the expert in balancing 3 kids, and we're all complete nightmares. And sorry, mum. But how did you sort of acknowledge this, imposter syndrome? Was it in the moment that you went, right, okay, I'm experiencing this, or was it somebody telling you, actually, Sally, it's imposter syndrome, you're amazing, how did you sort of come to grips with it, and how did you overcome it?
Well, I think that's the point. At the time, I didn't know.
You didn't know.
It was only after that reflection, when we'd started talking about it last year, that I thought, actually, I recognise those feelings, but at the time it wasn't something that people really talked about. It was a good few years ago now. And I think, I kind of just got on with it, and eventually it passed. And that's probably, as I say, down to the fact that I had a very supportive manager at the time. I had colleagues around me who maybe they recognised it, or maybe they understood that I was just, maybe having a bit more of a difficult time when you come back to work after having a child, and they just naturally, helped you or put you at ease. So I think people would recognise it more now because people talk about it more. Yeah. It's much higher up on the agenda, and people are happy to share their stories. When I was asked to talk about it last year, at first I probably didn't feel comfortable talking about it because it wasn't something I'd acknowledged.
Yeah.
But once I'd acknowledged it and thought it through, and actually, yes, maybe it did affect me, but actually it wasn't overly detrimental. And there are things you can do to make sure you've got the right support mechanisms in place so that it doesn't affect you.
What advice would you give to people who are managing, people, if you've got an operational manager and you were managing yourself now, what advice would you give those people now?
So as a leader, it's really important to understand that every one of your colleagues is different. That's the biggest thing for me. It's about really adapting the way that you deal with each one of your team, dependent on who they are, what makes them tick, maybe some of the issues that they're facing, and really being empathetic to their individual situation. It's not one size fits all. It's about really assessing your team and getting to know them and understanding what you can do to support and being that sounding board for them. And if you can't be that sounding board for them, ensuring they've got a mentor that can be that sounding board, or ensuring they're linked in with the right colleagues and they've got that network around them to support them.
So, Sally, the NHS Property Services has a unique hiring capability, scale of workforce. What are the challenges from a hiring perspective you guys are currently facing at the moment?
There are a number of challenges, and that's probably because, my team is quite diverse. We go from our frontline colleagues, domestic soft services colleagues, our frontline hard FM colleagues. That's challenging in itself in terms of pay scales and ensuring we've got the right trades in the right places to do the right jobs at the right time, up to the senior managers that I have working for me within my team. Ultimately, we hire for attitude and train for skills. So that's really important to us. We want colleagues who are engaged and understand what we're trying to deliver to our customers. And so that's the most important thing. And we do have some really good development programs within the organisation, which then help us develop that talent and move them around the organisation. For me, the challenge lately has been around our property and FM colleagues. So my team is a team of estates delivery partners and senior estates managers. And then they flow down to estates coordinators and our frontline teams that deliver the services on the ground within our properties. In the recent restructure, we merged the FM and property roles, which means that we're looking for really well-rounded individuals who can encompass the property side of the role, but also deliver the facilities management operational side of the role. And that's not naturally been a role that has been around the market previously. No. So where we've been trying to recruit them, we've tried to get a really good balance across the teams, and then we've tried to get colleagues to buddy up, and where we've got a property background colleague and an FM background colleague, we ask them to work together so that they can then decide what extra skills they need in able to give them that well-rounded view of that role. And that's actually working really well. But it's about finding those right colleagues in the first place and then developing them and retaining them for the future.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think you touched upon it there, that hire for attitude. I think lots of hiring managers use it. Obviously, those of us in recruitment hear it a lot. What does that look like for you? When you're sat down across the room from somebody, you're looking at somebody's attitude, what are the things that really sort of speak to you? What are those, if somebody's got an interview with you next week, Sally, what are the things that you can tell them right now? You go, these are the things I look for. This is the kind of attitude that works best for us.
It's about understanding that well-rounded view. So when I'm interviewing colleagues to join my team, I talk to them a lot about how would you deal with these situations, and what I'm looking for in the answers is not a one-dimensional response. It's about how they would see the bigger picture, how they would encompass what we need to deliver for our customer, as well as doing the right thing for us as a business. And it's a can-do attitude. It's about rolling your sleeves up and being part of the team. Especially where you've got frontline teams delivering every day. And that was particularly pertinent during COVID. You know, we couldn't all work at home during COVID because we are a frontline business. And our managers really get that, because our frontline colleagues are there living and breathing the clinical delivery every day alongside our NHS colleagues. So for my managers, it's about really understanding what that looks like and being prepared to be involved in that.
And when we're talking about sort of the NHS, I think some people, when they're looking at sort of applying for jobs, they will probably go, you know what, I've never worked in the NHS. Now, obviously we've already talked about it. You didn't either. But, what other types of backgrounds would you consider pretty much anybody coming from a wider range of property backgrounds? Does that exist already within your sort of staff as it currently is?
Yeah, so my team is a diverse set of colleagues who have come from different aspects of the corporate world and other public sector organisations. So having a background within the NHS isn't necessary, but what is necessary is that passion and that drive to really understand who we are as a business and how we fit into the wider NHS system and why we're here, which is ultimately to enable excellent patient care, and that is linked in with our NHS colleagues.
So Sally, I think what would be really useful is for, I think for our listeners is somebody, who's perhaps maybe not considered the NHS before listening today. They've probably listened to this, loved what you've had to say. How would you describe the culture for NHS property services, and maybe even more particularly your team here in London?
So the culture is really important to me, and that's part of the reason I've been here for 5 years.
Yeah.
We aim to get, grow, keep great colleagues. We have to act responsibly, ultimately, because we are part of the wider NHS system, and everything we do reflects on that delivery. And we empower our teams to deliver to a high standard for our customers. And how that manifests itself is how we drive our teams to collaborate cross-functionally across our business to deliver. So when I've talked about us being a strategic partner to the NHS, we deliver the frontline services, but we've got a wealth of other capability across our business that we tap into in order to deliver that best service to our NHS colleagues. And we're very much about the community. We are based in our communities. A lot of my team live within their communities and work at NHS buildings within their communities. Yeah. So they're delivering effectively to their own neighbourhood. And that's also really important. And we do a lot of work around social prescribing and we do a lot of volunteering around that community, hand in hand with our sort of day job.
Fantastic. And I think that in itself is a huge puller and lever for some individuals that are looking for maybe a different calling in work. Would you say that that's what it is, what lures people there?
Absolutely. I think it drives a pride.
Yes.
A lot of my team will talk about how proud they are to work for the NHS and deliver that good service. And as I said to you before, it's about going home at the end of the day and feeling like you've really made a difference. And that is something that really drives a lot of the team.
So Sally, wouldn't be doing you justice if I didn't give you the options for a bit of a call to arms, right? This opportunity for you to, put it out there. Is there anything you're actively hiring for right now? Is there anywhere that you're short-staffed looking for people?
So the majority of our sort of turnover in colleagues tends to be on the front line. So for our domestic colleagues and our engineers. From a management point of view, I'm very lucky to have just filled my latest vacancy by yourself. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
And I think a little bit of learning from that experience. It took a few months to find the right candidate. And my team are quite busy, and I think we did a couple of interviews on Teams. I did a face-to-face interview and reflected back to my team in terms of the benefit of face-to-face interviews. For me now, any interviews on Teams just don't wash. For me, it's about seeing that candidate face to face and really, really getting that rapport and getting that conversation going, and understanding that that candidate and where they're coming from and whether they fit what we're looking for. So so for me, I'd be suggesting to candidates to absolutely push for face-to-face interviews, because I think you can generally come across a lot better face-to-face than if you're invited to a Teams or an online interview. I guess anyone out there who wants to pursue a career within NHS property services, I would encourage them to look at our website, because one thing I really like when I see candidates for the first time is that they've done their homework.
Yeah.
They understand who we are. They understand what we do, because ultimately, if they don't know who we are and what we do, I can't be reassured that they are really serious and passionate about coming to work for us. So I'd say the starting point is have a look at our website, get that background, and there's links on there to contact our head of recruitment and kind of start that process.
Wonderful. That's great. And it's funny there you mentioned, the interview process, that face-to-face, how important that is. And I think, me and colleagues, and we talk about this from a recruitment perspective quite a lot, is that maybe the faux pas people make in the interview process. Now, as the managing director and as being a people leader for a long time, Sally, you've seen your fair share of faux pas. I definitely have, either recruiting for my own team or then getting the feedback from my hiring managers. Is there anything here today that you would share as general advice to people right now, things that you like to see? And that could be around CVs, face-to-face, presentation, having your camera on in an interview. It could be anything, but what are the things that sort of your bugbears really?
Well, I mean, having your camera on would be 100%. Absolutely.
You'd be surprised.
So going back to what I said before in terms of being prepared.
Yes.
I really get frustrated when I talk to a candidate who doesn't know who we are or hasn't even looked up a little bit of our background. I don't expect people to know everything about us, but for me, that's one of the keys, because that really shows that interest. Think about the environment you're going into in terms of how you present yourself, because now different organisations have different kind of dress codes, different vibes. I totally get that, but I think it's really important to think about what you're walking into and how you should present yourself in that respect, and have a couple of questions ready, I think, for the interviewers at the end. I always feel that an interview feels cut short if a candidate has no questions. Yeah. On the other side, if somebody comes in with a list of 10 questions, maybe that sort of is the opposite. But yeah, I think that would be the key ones for me.
Wonderful. And I think, look, that's really important advice for anybody. I think, look, it's basic presentation. I think it's really important. I'm a big believer in sort of always overdress instead of underdress. So if you're ever unsure, it's just, nothing wrong with looking smart. I've never heard of somebody not getting a job because they were overdressed.
Yeah.
That does not mean top hat and tails. Anybody listening, that might be a bit OTT. I've not had that. But unfortunately, I have had great people for the right roles, maybe miss out because they've got that part wrong. So, first impressions count, right?
Absolutely. And I would add on first impressions, from a CV point of view,
yes,
something we've talked about previously, I would encourage people to think about the length of their CV, because, as time goes on within your career, it's important to pull out those key roles, yes, and some of the things that you've achieved. However, if it extends, to multiple pages, 10, 14 pages, say, I would say, you're not gonna do yourself the best representation, because potentially that person who's going to be interviewing you isn't going to be able to take all that in. So I would keep it a little bit more succinct and really focus on those sort of latter roles that you've done, and then pull out any key points, but maybe just in a shortened version at the end of your CV. Yeah,
absolutely. I think what I've seen, unfortunately, some people get in a habit of is they redo their CV between role, but they haven't condensed the other parts.
Yeah.
Or they may just copy a job description and put that in. And we all know the job description is never really the job, and it's not the bit that sells you best, right? It is, what have you achieved in that time, projects you've delivered. It's the highlight reel, not the put me to sleep reel. Yeah. And I think that's really important. So I think any advice, I think great, absolutely, is take your time on your CV, get it right. Don't use these CV template writers. I think we've probably both seen a lot of those, and they don't work either. So find a trusted recruitment partner, and get their advice, but at the very least speak to some of your colleagues as well. Sally, finally, for any of our FM listeners out there in particular, I guess actually probably for anybody really looking for a role in property, what are the 3 key things somebody can take away from today's conversation and put into their day-to-day lives to better their roles and to get the most out of their careers?
So for me, it would be flexible. Think about a role, but think about what you could do more widely.
Yeah.
Be inquisitive, so always do your research, but always look for more information. Always look wider than the task in hand, and be resilient. So if things don't go according to plan, or they don't go the way you want them to, or if you don't get the job that you want immediately, be resilient and think further as to what you can do to get to that point.
Great. Sally, thank you ever so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. And to all our listeners, catch you on the next episode. Thanks. Thank you.